Get out of the car, old woman, before I drag you out myself." Those words left Lieutenant Ryan Kovach's mouth with a poisonous ease he would soon regret for the rest of his life. Because this single sentence, uttered on a quiet Thursday morning, would tear apart his entire career, expose a buried culture of misconduct, and place him on a path toward federal prison. He stepped closer without hesitation, yanked the door open, and seized Judge Evelyn Harper's wrist so hard her body stiffened in pain. His grip crushed fragile bone and pulled her forward with a violent jerk, her shoulder snapping against the edge of the Buick's frame as her handbag spilled onto the pavement. In that moment, with fog still hanging over Salem Avenue and the city not yet awake, the humiliation was complete. A 72-year-old federal judge, revered across Ohio, stood trembling beside her own car as two patrol officers treated her like a trespasser in the world she had spent 50 years upholding through law and service. Before we go into this story, let me ask you one thing. Where are you watching from today? Take a moment. Type it in the comments. And while you are here, subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps these stories reach more people who want truth, accountability, and justice. Lieutenant Kovach had already decided how this morning would unfold long before he saw the slate-gray Buick LaCrosse easing south toward downtown. He spotted the vanity plate Judge 1 and felt something dark, cold, and old rise inside him, to him. This was not a driver. This was a score unsettled. This was the woman who had once placed his friend Tommy Burke on death row. He nudged Sergeant Christopher McAllister, who sat in the passenger seat of their battered Crown Vic, and muttered, "Look who decided to crawl today. No lights, no siren, no lawful basis." He simply pulled out behind her and waved her to the curb as though the law itself had bent for his convenience. Evelyn Harper lowered her window with calm dignity when he approached. Her voice carried the even strength of someone who had spent a lifetime weighing words carefully. "Lieutenant, may I ask what statute I violated this morning?" She knew the law better than anyone on that street. She knew the Ohio Revised Code did not contain the phrase impeding the flow of traffic, the excuse Kovach invented on the spot. She watched him shift his weight, watched the tension in his jaw, watched a familiar resentment ignite in his eyes. It was the look she had seen on the faces of men who confused authority with power. She did not know yet that he had already decided she would not leave this street standing. Kovach ordered her out for a safety check. She refused to open her trunk without a warrant. She did not raise her voice. She did not move with defiance. She simply stated her rights, and that alone was enough to trigger the fury he carried like a weapon. He reached for her arm again. Metal clicked sharply as he snapped the cuffs on with deliberate force. The cold steel bit into her thin wrists. Her body bent forward slightly as he tightened the bracelets without warning. McAllister hesitated 4 full seconds before attaching the second cuff, his conscience struggling against the moment. But his loyalty to Kovach held him trapped. He locked the bracelet with a quiet click that sounded, even to him, like a betrayal. Evelyn stood there, studying the sidewalk through the blur of her own shock, her breath steady but her heart pounding against the reality that 2 white patrol officers had just placed handcuffs on a federal judge in open daylight without cause. 50 feet away, Officer Lauren Brooks froze. She had been on the job for less than a year. Idealistic, hopeful, determined to serve a city she believed in. She watched Lieutenant Kovach twist a 72-year-old woman's arms behind her back and felt her stomach drop so hard she could barely breathe. She had seen questionable stops before, moments that felt wrong but were swallowed by silence. This time, something inside her refused to stay quiet. She reached slowly for her personal phone, palms sweating, and hit record. Her breath trembled. She knew what she was doing. She knew the risk. She also knew that if she did nothing, She would become part of the very machine she feared, through the phone's tiny lens. She captured the moment Judge Evelyn Harper, who had sworn in mayors, sentenced cartel leaders, and lectured law students on constitutional restraint, stood in handcuffs beside her own car like a criminal stripped of dignity. Kovach searched her vehicle without grounds. He opened her handbag and dumped it onto the sidewalk. Lip balm, reading glasses, prescription bottles, pens, tissues, a folded grocery receipt, a clipped article she had saved for Daniel Weiss, and finally her federal judicial credentials slid out and hit the pavement with a sharp clatter. The gold eagle in the center caught the morning light. It gleamed, it warned, it accused. Kovach picked it up, held it between two fingers, and smirked. "Nice fake, Your Honor." The contempt in his voice sliced through the air. He tossed the credential booklet back onto the pile of scattered items as though it were meaningless. To him, it was a challenge. To Evelyn, it was the moment she understood that what was happening was no mistake. This was deliberate, personal, dangerous. Sergeant McAllister watched the scene unravel but said nothing. Inside, he felt a knot tightening around his ribs. He could hear his own pulse. He wondered how far Kovach intended to take this. He wondered whether silence would now cost him his life or his soul. He made the wrong choice. He chose silence. Evelyn was placed in the back of the cruiser. She sat upright despite the crushing weight of humiliation. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She stared forward, breathing evenly, the cuffs cutting thin grooves into her skin. She told herself to stay calm, to stay alive, and to remember every detail because truth had a way of returning, even from dark places, as the door closed on her. Kovach walked back to the Buick with satisfaction settling across his shoulders. He believed he had put a judge in her place. He did not know he had just placed himself on the path toward indictment, national disgrace, and the end of everything he once thought untouchable. This was only the beginning. The city of Dayton had not yet awakened to see what had been done to one of its most respected jurists. But by the time the sun completed its arc across the sky, the world would know her name. The video would travel farther than any of them imagined, and the first cracks would appear in a department long protected by silence. Kovach crouched beside the scattered belongings on the sidewalk and reached again for Evelyn Harper's judicial credentials, as if touching them proved something about his own authority. The gold emblem glinted in the thin morning light, a symbol known in every courthouse across the federal system. Yet he held it between two fingers with open disdain. "Nice fake, Your Honor," he repeated, letting the insult hang in the air with a cruel satisfaction that revealed how deeply he resented the woman before him. When he dropped the credential booklet onto the pavement a second time, it struck the concrete with a sound sharper than its weight should have made, a small metallic echo that carried humiliation straight into Evelyn's chest. Her arms remained pinned behind her, wrists locked in steel, as her entire handbag lay overturned at her feet with its contents scattered like debris from a life she had lived with dignity. Sergeant Christopher McAllister shifted uneasily nearby, sweat rising along his collar, torn between the voice in his head urging him to intervene and the louder, heavier voice reminding him that Lieutenant Kovach had carried him through years of debt, bad decisions, and disciplinary shadows. His loyalty had become a trap he no longer knew how to escape. Officer Aisha Reynolds arrived at that moment, stepping out of her cruiser with the instinctive calm of a veteran who had seen too much and learned to read trouble before the first word was spoken. She approached the scene expecting a typical stop, but the sight before her shattered that assumption instantly. There stood Judge Evelyn Harper, someone Aisha respected deeply, handcuffed on a public sidewalk like a dangerous suspect. Aisha stopped cold. She felt the breath leave her chest. She knew Evelyn from courtrooms, from community events, from quiet conversations about the burdens black women carried in institutions that seldom valued them. "Lieutenant?" Aisha said slowly, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "You have Judge Harper in cuffs." Kovach turned toward her with a dismissive grin. "Stand down. Reynolds. Or join her." That sentence carried the weight of a threat and the promise of retaliation. Aisha felt the warning settle into her bones. She could comply and remain untouched, or she could speak and risk her future. But even as fear tightened in her stomach, she could not look away from Evelyn's wrists, bound behind her back, the thin red marks forming under the cuffs, the quiet strength in her posture despite the humiliation. Aisha stepped closer. "Lieutenant, this is not." Kovach cut her off sharply. "Last warning. Stand down." Aisha froze. She could protect Evelyn only by living long enough to tell the truth. And so she stood there, silent on the outside and burning on the inside, as the two men she outranked morally but not in rank continued the assault on a woman she revered. Evelyn was placed into the back of the cruiser for transport. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud that echoed like a verdict delivered without evidence. She sat upright, back straight, refusing to bend to the humiliation. She inhaled slowly and reminded herself, survive first, speak later. What she did not know yet was that this moment, these minutes of unlawful restraint, would soon unravel years of hidden misconduct within a department that had operated with near impunity, at West Patrol Division headquarters. The humiliation deepened. Kovach marched her inside with no explanation, no paperwork, no rights read. He ordered McAllister to bolt her to the metal bench. McAllister hesitated again, swallowing hard, but eventually secured the shackle around her ankle. Evelyn sat there, hands still cuffed behind her, spine rigid against the cold steel. Time stretched into an unbearable crawl. 3 hours and 40 minutes passed without water, without a phone call, without even the courtesy of acknowledging her title or humanity. Officers walked past with sidelong glances, whispers, and nervous stiffening at the sight of a woman who commanded authority even while restrained, through the one-way glass. Kovach stood with McAllister, both men staring at her with the self-righteousness of those convinced they were untouchable. She put Tommy Burke on death row. Kovach muttered under his breath. She doesn't get to just drive around like nothing happened. His voice shook with resentment he had carried for years. Tommy Burke. An officer gone rogue, convicted after a brutal shooting, sentenced by Judge Harper herself. Kovach had never forgiven her. To him, this was not a traffic stop. This was vengeance dressed as procedure. McAllister nodded weakly, though he looked more sick than vindicated. He knew Tommy Burke's file. He knew the evidence. He knew the sentence had been correct. But he also knew that defying Kovach meant losing the only friend who had shielded him through a mountain of personal failings and financial ruin. From the bench, Evelyn listened to muffled voices behind the glass, but she did not speak. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath, refusing to let the shame consume her. She had faced cartel bosses, domestic terrorists, corrupt officials, and violent offenders. Yet nothing in her long life had prepared her for the quiet cruelty of being treated like a criminal by men who knew nothing of her work, or her sacrifice. Still, she kept her voice inside her chest, held firm against the growing ache in her arms and legs, reminding herself that truth, when it came, would not whisper. It would roar. Aisha Reynolds stood at her desk across the room, watching everything through the partial reflection on the glass panel of the door, unable to intervene but unable to pretend she saw nothing. Her hands tightened around the folder she was holding. She thought of her father, who told her once that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of cruelty. She wanted to step forward. She wanted to unbolt the shackle. She wanted to speak. But she knew Kovacs. She knew what retaliation looked like in this department, and she knew she needed to survive long enough to do something that mattered. So she watched, waited, calculated, and prayed she would find a way to make this right, behind the main desk. The officers on shift exchanged glances. Some recognized Evelyn, some suspected. None had the courage to challenge Kovacs or ask questions. The culture of fear inside West Patrol had taken years to build. Now it held every witness still. And then, in the quietest corner of the station, a decision was made that would change everything. Lauren Brooks, the rookie officer who had recorded the stop, sat alone in her marked cruiser replaying the footage she had captured. Her conscience tore at her with every passing second. She knew what she had witnessed. She knew what it meant. She knew what this department had become. She also knew what staying silent would make her. So as the morning moved toward noon, and as Judge Evelyn Harper remained shackled on a cold metal bench, Lauren raised her phone again. Her hands trembled. Her breath shook. But her resolve was steady. She hit send. And the world was about to learn what happened inside West Patrol. Lauren Brooks did not sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment off North Main Street, staring at the ceiling as the hours dragged by, each minute pressing heavier on her chest than the one before it. The image of Judge Evelyn Harper's wrists in handcuffs replayed again and again behind her eyes, refusing to fade, refusing to lessen its weight. By 2:17 a.m., when the city outside her window lay silent under a thin blanket of cold autumn air, Lauren sat up with a quiet gasp and reached for her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen for several long seconds, her pulse loud in her ears. She knew exactly what sending the video would do. It would end her career. It might end her safety. It would certainly destroy the protection she had once believed existed for honest officers. But she could not bear the thought of staying silent. She opened Signal, selected the only contact she trusted outside the department, Marcus Ellison of the Dayton Daily News, and attached the full, unedited video. She typed 3 words that carried every ounce of fear and courage she had left. "I can't be part of this." Then she sent it. Marcus Ellison woke before dawn, as he often did, scanning overnight tips with the focused instinct of a young reporter who had grown up watching the city he loved bend under the weight of its own failures. When he saw the message from an unknown number with the attached video file, he expected another false lead, another shaky recording of an argument or a rumor. But when he opened the file, his breath caught. He watched as a 72-year-old black federal judge was yanked from her car, handcuffed, mocked, and shoved before a group of laughing officers. He watched Kovacs sneer at her credentials. He watched Evelyn Harper's dignity stripped in pieces. Marcus leaned back, stunned, knowing that nothing recorded inside the Dayton Police Department had ever looked like this. By 6:12 a.m., the video appeared on the Dayton Daily News homepage, accompanied by a single headline: "Federal Judge Detained by Dayton Police." 90 minutes later, it had spread beyond the city's borders. By noon, 5 million people had watched it, and by late afternoon, Judge in Cuffs was the #1 trend nationwide in Cincinnati, 50 miles south. Kayla Harper sat at her desk inside the U.S. Attorney's office, scrolling through emails when the alert popped up on her phone. She froze as she read the headline. Her heart lurched. She clicked the link. The moment the video began, she knew. She knew the posture, the voice, the steady dignity even in humiliation. "Grandma," she whispered under her breath as tears pressed into her vision. She stood abruptly, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the office without a word to anyone. The highway blurred beneath her tires as she sped back to Dayton, her hands gripping the wheels so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Rage, fear, and purpose churned inside her with equal force. By the time she reached the city, The video had already lit the federal circuits like a wildfire. Kayla entered the Richard H. Austin Federal Building and filed an emergency civil rights complaint with the Department of Justice before noon. She attached sworn affidavits, cited precedents, submitted the statutory violations, and demanded immediate intervention. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not falter. She was not only a granddaughter, she was an assistant United States attorney with power to act at West Patrol Division. Panic was spreading faster than orders. Chief of Patrol Timothy R. Harlan arrived at headquarters, red-faced and furious, demanding to know why a federal judge had been handled like a vagrant. But fury soon twisted into fear when he realized the scope of potential fallout. He called an emergency closed-door meeting, ordering every unit supervisor into the briefing room. The meeting lasted 11 tense minutes. When the door opened, Harlan issued a quiet command that carried the weight of institutional decay. Wipe every frame, station video, hallway video, dash cam, body cam, all of it. Now. The officers in the room exchanged glances, some hesitant, some resigned, all aware of what they were being asked to do. But the command came from the top, and in a department where defiance had consequences. Obedience came swiftly. Aisha Reynolds was suspended without pay by 3:00 p.m. She received the notice in a single envelope handed across a desk with no explanation beyond administrative reasons pending review. She stared at the words for several seconds, feeling the air in her lungs thin. She had tried to speak. She had been silenced. She walked out of the building with her badge and weapon surrendered, knowing full well this suspension was not meant to correct misconduct. It was meant to eliminate a witness. Across the city, the video continued to spread. Churches shared it. Neighborhood associations shared it. Veterans groups shared it. Civil rights organizations shared it. News outlets across the country repeated the clip in slow motion. Evelyn forced from her car, her credentials mocked, her wrists cinched in steel. Legal experts weighed in, calling the stop unconstitutional, unethical, unlawful, and dangerous. Former judges spoke out. Members of the Ohio congressional delegation issued statements. The public was outraged, and inside Dayton, the silence of the department became its own confession. Lauren Brooks sat alone in her car behind the station, the weight of her decision settling heavily around her. She had expected fear. She had expected guilt. What she did not expect was the sense of clarity that followed. She had done the right thing. She knew it. Her conscience no longer pressed on her like a burden. But she also understood that what came next would shape the rest of her life. She placed her forehead against the steering wheel, breathing slowly, steadying herself. She would not run. She would not deny it. She would stand behind what she had done. Meanwhile, at her quiet home in Five Oaks, Judge Evelyn Harper sat in silence after being released with no apology, no explanation, and no documentation. She learned about the video only when Kayla burst through her front door in tears, blurting out the truth between sobs. Evelyn listened, her face calm, but her heart raw. She had lived through segregation, discrimination, and the long battle to claim her place in the judiciary. But nothing in her long career compared to watching a nation react to her humiliation in real time. Her pain became a mirror for a country that still struggled to reconcile power and justice. By 9:00 p.m., national news outlets had camped outside West Patrol headquarters. Protesters began gathering along Salem Avenue. City officials scrambled, state officials scrambled. The Department of Justice confirmed it had received Kayla's complaint. And at the same hour, inside a darkened office on the station's second floor, Chief Harlan signed a document he hoped would disappear, a directive to erase the internal footage from that morning. His hand trembled as he wrote, "Deep down." He knew the truth. Once the world saw the video, this cover-up would not save him. It would only bury him deeper, and somewhere in the center of the chaos. The city of Dayton began to shift. The silence of those who once looked away was breaking. The truth was no longer hidden. The video had spoken, and nothing in this department would ever be the same again. Lieutenant Ryan Kovach sat behind his cluttered desk early the next morning, jaw clenched, eyes red with anger and fear as he typed the opening lines of the report that he hoped would save him. He knew the video was out. He knew the world had seen Judge Evelyn Harper standing in handcuffs on Salem Avenue. He knew his own face was now the symbol of a department collapsing under its own weight. But he also knew something else. If he admitted even one moment of what he had done, the ground beneath him would give way. So he did what men like him had done for years inside West Patrol. He wrote a lie, then another, then a dozen more. By the time he finished the 6-page narrative, he had rebuilt the morning from memory into a version that absolved him of every sin. He claimed Judge Harper became combative and threatened officers with legal action, that she refused multiple lawful commands, that she attempted to reach for unknown items that could have been weapons. He described a scenario so distorted, so opposite of the truth captured on Lauren Brooks's phone, that even McAllister, standing behind him reading over his shoulder, felt his stomach tighten. Yet when Kovach handed him the pen and pointed to the signature line, McAllister signed his name with a shaky hand, binding himself to a story he knew could never survive the light. They walked together to Chief of Patrol Timothy R. Harlan's office and placed the report on his desk. Harlan read it in silence, expression thick with calculation. The department's top protector, a man who prided himself on shielding his officers no matter the cost, closed the folder and said only, "I'll take care of it." He opened a locked drawer, slid the report inside, and turned the key with a final click that felt more like the sealing of a tomb than the filing of paperwork. At that very hour, Special Agent Victor M. Torres of the FBI Dayton Resident Agency received a call from Washington. His orders were simple: review the complaint filed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Kayla Harper, conduct a cursory inquiry, close the file within 30 days, no interviews beyond what was necessary, no subpoenas, no broad digging, keep the peace, keep the city quiet. Torres had done enough internal cases to know exactly what that meant. He arrived at West Patrol that afternoon, greeted by stiff nods and shuttered expressions. He understood immediately that he was walking into a department that did not want him there, a department accustomed to surviving scrutiny without suffering consequences. But he also knew he had instructions to follow. At least, that's what he thought as he drove to Five Oaks to meet Evelyn Harper for what he assumed would be a quick, compliant conversation. When Torres arrived at Evelyn's home, he expected to see a shaken woman, someone eager to provide a statement, eager to close the matter, eager to move forward without conflict. Instead, when she opened the door, he saw a woman who carried 72 years of wisdom and endurance in her quiet eyes. She invited him inside with calm politeness, not fear, not anger, not submission. She sat across from him, hands folded carefully on her lap, and listened as he repeated the script he had been given. A preliminary review, a short inquiry, certain protocols, limited scope. Evelyn waited until he finished. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but unwavering. "Agent Torres," she said, "I will answer any question you have, but before you ask me anything, I want you to answer one yourself." Torres braced, expecting something emotional or accusatory. Instead, she asked the one question he had never expected to hear spoken so plainly. "Are you here to protect the badge?" she said. "Or the Constitution?" The room felt suddenly smaller. Torres felt his throat tighten. In all his years with the FBI, no one had ever asked him that. Not like that. Not with that level of moral clarity. He did not answer. He could not answer. Evelyn watched him, and in that silence she understood everything she needed to know about the forces aligned against her. She saw the conflict behind his eyes. She saw the orders he had been given, and she knew her fight would reach far beyond the two men who placed cuffs on her wrists. Meanwhile, at West Patrol, Chief Harlan was orchestrating the most elaborate attempt at institutional damage control the department had undertaken in years. He summoned the IT supervisor into his office and locked the door behind him. "Every internal recording from yesterday is to be overwritten," Harlan said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who believed himself untouchable. "And make sure the system logs reflect routine maintenance. I don't want inconsistencies." The supervisor hesitated. "Sir, federal investigators. We'll see what I allow them to see." Harlan snapped. "Handle it." The supervisor nodded weakly and left, his conscience gnawing at him even as he prepared to erase the only official footage that could corroborate the truth. Harlan then turned to Aisha Reynolds. She had been suspended only hours earlier, her badge and firearm taken, her credibility under targeted attack. Harlan called her into his office, closed the blinds, and spoke with a coldness she had never heard from him before. "You stay away from this," he said. "You don't talk to the media. You don't talk to federal agents. You don't talk to anyone. If you do, your career ends here." Aisha listened, her jaw tightening. She had survived years in a department that tolerated misconduct because it protected itself above all. But she had never imagined she would stand this close to the heart of the corruption. She left the office in silence, but her fury burned with a clarity that would soon guide every choice she made. Torres left Evelyn's home unsettled. The question she posed followed him back to his vehicle like a persistent echo. He sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, wrestling with the realization that he could not complete the assignment he had been given without betraying not only her, but the oath he had sworn. He drove away with the weight of a decision he had not yet made, but one that was already rewriting itself inside him. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, the cover-up thickened. Harlan's instructions were carried out. Internal videos disappeared. Body cam files degraded mysteriously. Hard drives were wiped. The department closed its ranks, but in the darkness, outside their control, a truth stronger than their secrecy had already taken root. The leaked recording lived on millions of screens. Kayla's complaint was already circulating through the highest levels of the Justice Department and deep inside Agent Torres. A fracture had begun that Harlan had not anticipated. The Dayton Police Department believed it could bury this story under paperwork and silence, but the ground beneath them was shifting. The truth Evelyn Harper carried in her quiet dignity was no longer contained in a single video. It had become a force moving through the conscience of everyone who had seen it. The cover-up had begun, but so had the reckoning. The fracture began quietly, without announcement, in the heart of a department that had relied on silence for decades. It began with a trembling breath, a trembling hand, and a trembling decision that Officer Lauren Brooks knew would change the entire course of her life. She woke on Friday morning with a knot in her stomach so tight she could barely swallow. Her video had gone viral. Her name was not yet public. But she knew it was only a matter of time before someone traced the leak back to her. She arrived at West Patrol wearing her uniform with the same precision she had practiced since the academy. But her hands shook as she clipped her radio to her belt. She walked past officers whispering in tight circles, past supervisors hiding fear behind stern expressions, past the thin blue wall that had been built long before she was born. She headed straight for internal affairs. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for an appointment. She simply walked in, placed her phone on the desk, and said, "I have the original unedited video." The investigator on duty froze. He stared at her as though she had placed a lit fuse in his hands. Within minutes, the file moved through secure channels, copied, logged, and forwarded to federal authorities who had been waiting for something more substantial than a viral clip. Lauren stood there, shoulders squared but trembling inside, knowing she had crossed a line she could never return from. She would not be protected. She would not be praised. She would likely be punished. But she would not be silent. Across the city. Aisha Reynolds felt the walls closing around her career. Suspended without pay, targeted by Chief Harlan, and labeled a disruptive influence. She knew her days in the department were numbered, but she also knew something else. The truth sitting inside Lieutenant Kovach's personnel jacket. She had seen it before. She had seen the complaints that vanished. She had seen the notations erased. She had seen the red flags buried under protective signatures. And so, late that afternoon, she walked into the administrative records room with steady steps. She requested access to Kovach's personnel file under the pretense of preparing a response to her suspension. The clerk, distracted and overworked, unlocked the cabinet and left her alone. Aisha opened the jacket and felt her breath hitch. Page after page revealed a history the public had never seen. 3 prior excessive force complaints, all against black motorists, 1 domestic disturbance report involving a neighbor, an internal reprimand reduced to a verbal warning by Harlan himself, a cruiser camera malfunction on the same day another attorney accused Kovach of harassment. She scanned each document, photographing them quickly but carefully, her pulse pounding. When she reached the back of the file, she found an email she had never seen before. Dated 2019 from Chief Harlan to Kovach. Keep her in check, whatever it takes. Aisha felt the words hit her with the force of a blow. She placed the phone back in her pocket, closed the file, and walked out with a clarity that made fear irrelevant. She drove across the city to meet Kayla Harper in a small parking lot behind an old church on West 3rd Street. Kayla arrived in minutes, stepping out of her car with a mixture of rage and gratitude burning behind her eyes. Aisha handed her the copied documents. "This is everything he buried," she said. "If I disappear after today, you have the truth." Kayla opened the folder under the dim afternoon light, saw the pattern, saw the email, and exhaled slowly. "You just changed the entire scope of this case," she whispered. Aisha nodded once, then make it count. Meanwhile, at the FBI resident agency, Agent Victor Torres sat alone at his desk long after his colleagues had gone home. Evelyn Harper's question, "Are you here to protect the badge or the Constitution?" played over and over in his mind like a clock refusing to advance. He knew the answer he wanted to give. He knew the answer he had been avoiding, and as he reviewed the file for the 10th time, he saw the cracks widening in the narrative fed to him by West Patrol. He saw inconsistencies in timestamps, missing internal video, conflicting statements, the suspicious speed of Aisha's suspension, the carefully orchestrated silence of the department. He stared at the image of Evelyn Harper standing in cuffs, her face composed but deeply wounded, and felt something shift within him that had been dormant for years. He opened his laptop, drafted a formal memo, and requested authorization to impanel a federal grand jury in Cincinnati. It was an extraordinary step for a case that had been expected to close quietly. But what he had uncovered, what Lauren and Aisha had risked everything to expose, demanded more than a quiet report. It demanded the full weight of federal authority. His request was approved by Monday morning. A secret federal grand jury was convened inside the Potter Stewart U.S. Courthouse in Cincinnati. Subpoenas went out quietly to city records departments, to digital storage vendors, to the West Patrol Administrative Office, to select Dayton city officials. Testimony began in small rooms with no windows, no cameras, and no leaks. Lauren Brooks was escorted into one of those rooms, trembling but resolute. She testified for 93 minutes, laying out the events with precision and honesty. She provided the original file. She identified Kovach's voice. She described the department culture. She spoke with the integrity she had always hoped the badge represented. When she finished, tears stung her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I recorded what I saw because it was wrong," she said, "and because nobody else ever would." Aisha's testimony followed. She laid out Kovach's history, Harlan's interventions, the email instructing him to keep her in check. She provided the photographs she had taken. She explained the retaliation she endured. And when she finished, she felt a burden lift, one that had been growing inside her from the moment she watched Evelyn Harper shackled to a bench without cause. Torres presented the timeline, the missing videos, the altered logs, the suspicious internal orders, and above all, the motive, revenge against a judge who had sentenced one of their own. The grand jury listened. The grand jury questioned. The grand jury moved closer and closer toward a conclusion that could not be softened. Back in Dayton, word began to spread quietly among officers that something unprecedented was happening. People whispered about sealed subpoenas, about FBI visits, about records disappearing, about careers collapsing. The culture of silence that had shielded West Patrol for years began to falter. Officers who once stood proudly behind the thin blue wall now felt cracks forming beneath their boots. In her small house in Five Oaks, Judge Evelyn Harper sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, reflecting on the strange and painful journey of the past days. She had endured public humiliation, unlawful detention, and a cover-up designed to erase her experience. But now the truth was moving forward with a momentum no one could stop. The fracture inside the department had become a widening break, one that would soon split open a system long thought untouchable. And in Cincinnati, behind doors guarded by U.S. Marshals, the grand jury prepared to issue the first of many decisions that would reshape Dayton forever. United States versus Kovach and McAllister opened on a gray Monday morning inside the Richard H. Austin Federal Building, a place where Evelyn Harper had once presided with calm authority and where she now returned as a witness whose dignity had been tested but not broken. The courtroom filled before sunrise, federal prosecutors in dark suits, uniformed deputies stationed along the walls, reporters from every major network lining the back rows, and a gallery packed with citizens from Dayton's west side who had watched the video and felt their own lives reflected in the injustice it revealed. Kovach entered first, hands cuffed at the waist, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles along his temples pulsed with each step. His eyes darted across the room, searching for sympathy, but none came. McAllister followed behind him, shoulders sagging under the weight of regret, his pale face betraying months of sleepless nights. The judge presiding, Hannah Rebecca L. Goldstein, took her seat with the steady calm of a jurist who understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. She reminded the jury that their task was simple but sacred: determine the truth, apply the law, and uphold the Constitution. The charges were read aloud, each one slicing through the quiet like a blade. Deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit civil rights violations. The defendants pleaded not guilty, but their voices cracked with hesitation, as though even they no longer believed the fiction they were clinging to. The prosecution opened with a timeline built piece by piece, word by word, moment by humiliating moment, each detail supported by documents the grand jury had gathered in secret. They displayed the viral video on a large screen, and the entire courtroom fell silent as Evelyn Harper's frail wrists appeared again, bound behind her by metal cuffs she had never imagined wearing. Gasps came from the gallery. A juror's hand rose to her mouth. The prosecutors paused the video at the precise second Kovach mocked her credentials, letting the image burn into the jurors' minds. "This," the lead prosecutor said softly, "is not policing. This is revenge." The defense objected, but the judge overruled. The truth stood on the screen. undeniable and unflinching, when Evelyn Harper took the stand. The room shifted into a reverent stillness. She was escorted by a deputy marshal, but she walked on her own, chin high, posture straight, every step carrying the weight of a woman who had stared down decades of injustice without losing her faith in the law. She was sworn in. She adjusted her glasses. Then she spoke. Her testimony lasted 11 minutes, each sentence measured, calm, and deliberate. "I was not afraid of the handcuffs," she said, her voice steady, soft, meant for the ears of the jurors and for the conscience of a nation watching. "I was afraid of a system that allows a man like Lieutenant Kovacs to keep the star on his chest." She described the stop without anger. She described the humiliation without bitterness. She described the pain without dramatization, and because she spoke plainly, truthfully, and without embellishment, her words carried a moral weight no defense argument could match. When she stepped down, even members of the press lowered their eyes in quiet respect. Next came Lauren Brooks. Her hands trembled as she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. She looked 20 years older than the rookie officer who had recorded the stop. But when she began to speak, her voice gained strength. She told the jury why she recorded the video. She told them what she had seen. She told them about the fear inside the department, the unspoken rules, the pressure, the warnings. "I took the video because I knew nobody else ever would," she said, "and because I could not live with myself if I stayed silent." The courtroom listened, breath held, as she recounted the moment she hit record and the moment she sent the file to the press. Her courage became one of the turning points of the trial. Then came Aisha Reynolds, suspended, threatened, isolated. She stepped into the courtroom with a calm resolve that filled the space around her. She testified about Kovacs's history. She testified about the 3 excessive force complaints that vanished. She testified about the domestic dispute report that disappeared. She testified about the cruiser camera malfunction. Then she handed the prosecutor a printed copy of the email she had found in Kovacs's personnel file, the one written by Chief Harlan. "Keep her in check. Whatever it takes." The courtroom exhaled in shock. The defense objected again. But the authenticity of the document had already been confirmed by federal investigators. The email became the centerpiece of the obstruction charge, the unmistakable fingerprint of a department that had long confused loyalty with lawlessness. Prosecutors then called Agent Victor Torres, whose testimony marked the moment the case became bigger than 2 officers in a patrol car. Torres explained the missing internal videos. He explained the altered logs. He explained the suspiciously timed maintenance order issued by Chief Harlan. And he explained, with controlled professional restraint, why he had impaneled a secret federal grand jury despite initial instructions to keep the investigation narrow. The evidence compelled it. He said simply. The jury listened, their faces tightening with the growing realization that the rot inside West Patrol went deeper than they had anticipated. The defense called Kovacs to the stand, hoping he could salvage the case with a narrative of confusion, stress, and perceived threat. But his anger betrayed him. His voice rose. His answers became contradictions. His claim that Evelyn Harper lunged toward her bag fell apart under cross-examination. And when the prosecutor asked, "Lieutenant, where is the internal hallway footage from that morning?" Kovacs hesitated one fatal second too long. The silence spoke louder than any answer. McAllister testified next. But unlike Kovacs, his voice shook with honesty forced out by months of guilt. He admitted he hesitated during the arrest. He admitted he followed Kovacs out of fear. He admitted he signed the falsified report knowing it wasn't true. His confession sealed the conspiracy count. When closing arguments ended, the jury retired to deliberate. The hours ticked by. 1, 2, 3, 4, while the courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, after 4 hours and 40 minutes, The jurors returned, their four-person rows, holding the verdict forms with both hands. On count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. On count 2, conspiracy, guilty. On count 3, obstruction of justice, guilty. The words echoed like a long-awaited exhale in a city that had held its breath for years. Kovacs closed his eyes, shoulders collapsing under the realization that the power he had abused was gone forever. McAllister wept quietly. In the gallery, Kayla held her grandmother's hand. Torres lowered his head. Aisha closed her eyes and breathed for the first time in months. Justice had spoken, and the reckoning was only beginning. Sentencing day arrived with the quiet gravity of a city preparing to confront a truth it could no longer deny. The Richard H. Austin Federal Building stood solemn under a pale sky as people gathered long before sunrise. Residents from Salem Avenue, retired teachers from Five Oaks, veterans who respected Judge Harper, young activists who had marched after the video went viral, and families who knew the sting of police misconduct long before the nation saw Evelyn's humiliation online. Inside the packed courtroom, Lieutenant Ryan Kovacs stood shackled at the wrists and ankles, wearing a plain charcoal suit that did little to hide the bitterness etched into his face. The swagger that once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow defiance born from the realization that his shield no longer protected him. Judge Rebecca Goldstein entered, her black robe flowing with the authority of someone who understood the historical weight of the moment. She read the sentencing guidelines with deliberate clarity, outlining every legal justification, every precedent, every detail that had brought Kovacs to the edge of a federal prison term. When she finally looked at him and delivered her decision. 9 years with no possibility of parole. The room fell silent. Kovacs' shoulders sagged, his jaw trembled, his lips pressed together as though he expected himself to hold steady and could not. His wife's seat remained empty. She had chosen not to witness what he had become, as marshals led him away. The echo of his chains carried through the chamber like a closing chapter in a long, painful story. And though the sentence offered no pleasure, it delivered something equally important. Acknowledgement that no badge could rise above the Constitution. Christopher McAllister stood before the court next. His posture was that of a man who had been living under the weight of regret since the day he clicked the second cuff around Evelyn Harper's wrist. He spoke briefly, voice cracking, acknowledging his complicity, his cowardice, and the fear that caused him to follow Kovacs instead of the law. Judge Goldstein, recognizing both his guilt and his cooperation, sentenced him to 4 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from law enforcement. Relief washed over McAllister like a wave he did not deserve, but desperately needed. As he stepped back from the podium, tears fell onto the polished courtroom floor. The punishment was not leniency, it was transformation. He would carry the consequences for the rest of his life, but he would carry them under the weight of accountability rather than denial. The next figure to face judgment was not in cuffs, not a defendant, but a man whose decisions had allowed the culture of West Patrol to fester unchecked. Chief of Patrol, Timothy R. Harlan sat stiffly as evidence of his obstruction, his cover-up, his orchestration of missing footage, and his direct order to keep her in check was laid bare. He was forced into early retirement within hours of the verdicts, stripped of 40% of his pension after a scathing internal review, and became the central defendant in the civil suit filed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Kayla Harper on behalf of her grandmother. When the judgment was read, $4.2 million in personal liability. Harlan's face drained of color. Bankruptcy followed. His reputation, once inflated by the image of a protector of the force, collapsed under the truth that he had protected only those who abused their authority. for Sergeant Aisha Reynolds. The reckoning brought something rare inside a department defined by retaliation, vindication. Her suspension was reversed, her record cleared, and after a formal review that highlighted her integrity, she was reinstated and promoted to lieutenant. When she returned to West Patrol for the first time since the morning Evelyn was handcuffed, officers stood a little straighter, not out of fear, out of respect. She walked down the hall toward her new office, head held high. Knowing the cost of her truth-telling had been heavy but necessary, she had not betrayed the badge. She had honored it, for Officer Lauren Brooks. The reckoning took a quieter form. The city, acknowledging her courage and the risk she had taken, awarded her a full-ride scholarship to law school, funded through settlement appropriations. She attended the announcement with trembling hands, still not used to being seen as anything but a rookie officer caught between conscience and survival. When Evelyn embraced her after the ceremony, Lauren felt decades of silence breaking inside her. She had recorded the truth when no one else dared, and now she was building a future dedicated to the same justice she helped uncover. As for Evelyn Harper, she moved through the city not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience that reached far beyond Dayton's borders. She attended community meetings, spoke at law schools about the dangers of unchecked authority, and met privately with officers who wanted to rebuild trust between the department and the communities it had long harmed. Yet amid the public attention, she returned most often to the quiet of her home in Five Oaks, where she found a peace that had felt impossible in the days following the stop. One quiet autumn morning, nearly 2 years after the incident, Evelyn eased her slate-gray Buick LaCrosse onto Salem Avenue, the same road where everything had begun. The sky was clear. The trees along the sidewalk shimmered with the gold of early fall. She drove slowly, her hands steady on the wheel, her heart calm in a way she had not experienced since before the wrongful stop. As she approached the same stretch of pavement where Kovacs had pulled her over, a patrol cruiser appeared behind her. The sight triggered a small, reflexive tightening in her chest, but she inhaled deeply and kept driving. The cruiser maintained a respectful distance. At the next light, the young officer inside activated his left turn signal, passed her gently, offered a brief nod she could see reflected in her mirror, and continued on his way. No aggression, no suspicion, no hostility, just a simple gesture of respect. Evelyn exhaled, a long, quiet breath she had been holding for 2 years. Her shoulders softened. A warmth settled through her chest in that small, ordinary moment. She understood what all the trials, all the hearings, all the public battles had been about. Not revenge, not spectacle, not punishment, transformation. A city that had once looked away was now learning to see. A department that had once silenced dissent was now rebuilding from within. And a community that had once feared the badge was starting, slowly, to trust again. As she drove on, Evelyn allowed herself something she had not felt since before that morning. A smile, small, gentle, hard-earned. A smile that carried history, struggle, and hope. Dayton was no longer the same city. It had been broken open, stripped bare, forced to confront its shadow. But in that confrontation, something new had taken root, something honest, something fragile, something worth protecting. And as the leaves drifted down in quiet gold around her, Judge Evelyn Marie Harper knew one truth with absolute certainty. Justice had not only been served, justice had changed the city forever. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.